Some rabbis who volunteered to work for the expulsion officially. They explained to the soldiers that they had to expel the settlers. They lied and said that according to the Torah, it was permitted to carry out the expulsion. There were rabbis who were secretly in the service of the government, and together with the YESHA council leaders, they prevented the crusade. IDF soldiers were issued special uniforms for the expulsion, a blue vest with the national emblem and flag on both sides. Policemen from the Special Police Patrol wore black overalls. The rabbis who worked for the expulsion wore orange vests with the word rabbi in the center. Their job was to help the army overcome any resistance on part of the crowd. The residents of Gan Or didn't let the army enter the settlement. Only after the army brought Rabbi Shlomo Aviner to the gate did the army manage to get in. In Netzer Chazani, during the week before the expulsion, Rabbi Mordechai alone used his rhetorical skills to prevent the residents from resisting. On the day of the expulsion, when the army broke through the roadblock set up by the residents of Netzer Chazani, Rabbi alone stood before the residents and instructed them to leave the settlement without resisting the army.
עכשיו לא להישאר כאן, אני מבקש שכולם בוא נצא מפה עכשיו. קדימה, נזוז.
בלי אדוני, בלי שום דבר, אופי כאן! תאופי כאן! תאופי כאן! אתה רואה מה אתה עושה? אתה רואה? אתה רואה מה אתה עושה? אתה לא אח שלי! אתם לא אחים שלי יותר!
There were families that the army couldn't get out of their houses. Rabbi alone used his religious authority to make them leave.
היינו 5 חבר'ה, ניסינו להתבצר בתוך אחד הבתים, הגיעה קבוצה של חיילים, נעלנו את כל הדלתות והחלונות, הם ניסו להיכנס ולא כל כך הצליחו, כל החיילים הלכו, ופתאום הם הגיעו ביחד עם הרב אלון. אני רואה את הרב אלון ואני לא מבין. מה הקטע? למה הרב בא עם המגרשים?
המשפחה, אני מודיע לך חד משמעית. אנחנו לא יוצאים מכאן בהסכמה.
In Katif, the Luber family refused to leave their home. Rabbi Tzvi Kostiner arrived and instructed them to stop resisting. The protesters from outside the Gush gathered at the gate of Neve Dikalim and stopped the army from entering. The rabbis, together with Tzviki Bar Chai and Mordechai Yogev, helped the army scatter the protesters.
פתאום וואלה, אתה רואה כאילו שהרב עוזר למשטרה, הוא מזיז אותך, הוא דוחף אותך, הוא מסדר אותך, מכוח סמכותו כמובן. כשאני ראיתי את זה עם החברים שלי, אני אמרתי לעצמי, יש פה משהו מוזר, יש פה משהו שהוא שקר, הוא לא נכון.
The army couldn't control the protesters who were scattered all over the Gush.
אם יד אחים ייכשל, ובכפר דרום ילמדו אותנו לקח, וביישוב אחר יסגרו לנו את השערים ולא נוכל להיכנס.
הכל בהחלט להסתבך. נווה דקלים, יש שם המוני מתנגדים.
מי שמעוניין להיאבק על בתי הכנסת של ערי ישראל, להיכנס עכשיו פנימה.
In an attempt to control the protesters, the YESHA Council, the Gush Katif Council, and the rabbis gathered them together in the synagogue, the women in the Ashkenazic synagogue, and the men in the Sephardic synagogue. They said that the crusade would only succeed if everyone worked together. The protesters didn't realize that they were being held captive in the synagogue to prevent them from resisting. Rabbi Shlomo Aviner and Mordechai Yogev were put in charge of the synagogue where the women were held. Rabbi Druckman, Zambish, Bar Chai, and Lieberman were put in charge of evacuating the synagogue where the men were held.
אני רוצה לומר את מה שאמרתי אתמול פה, ומה שאני אומר עכשיו. אנחנו קיבלנו החלטה, על פי בקשת תושבי נווה דקלים, ועל פי תפיסתנו, שמארץ ישראל ומנווה דקלים לא יוצאים בשירה וריקודים, ולא בסיכומים. אי אפשר לסכם על הפשע הזה שום סיכום.
The protesters didn't know that while they were being held captive in the synagogues, the YESHA Council was preparing to carry out the expulsion alongside the government forces. Here is the briefing given by Uri Bar-Lev, commander of the police force's Southern Division, to the YESHA Council leaders before breaking into the synagogues.
אנחנו נעשה את זה שזה יהיה מכובד. שהאירוע הזה יהיה האירוע המכובד שישאיר אותנו ביחד.
So that the press could show how the council was fighting the expulsion, they had themselves filmed shouting at the commanders of the government forces.
הרוח הזאת תנצח, ראש ממשלה שאיבד את הרוח.
Just beforehand, they had planned the evacuation of the synagogues with them and embraced them. Notice the order of the forces breaking into the Sephardic synagogue in Neve Dekalim. At the head of the team is a Shin Bet agent wearing an orange shirt and a big knitted yarmulke. In the center is Uri Bar Lev. Next to him is Zambish in the blue hat and orange ribbon. Next to Zambish is Tzviki Bar Chai in the white hat and green ribbon. One of their rabbis didn't manage to get into the synagogue. Bentzi Lieberman, in the orange shirt and green hat, opens the locked door for him from the inside. The rabbi goes in, Bentzi closes the door, and goes back to his seat in the front row of the synagogue. Although they had the key to the synagogue, the army pretended that the soldiers had to break into the fortified synagogue. The soldier removes the glass from the synagogue door. One pane of glass was enough to make the break-in look convincing. Now they open the synagogue doors, which weren't locked in the first place. The expulsion forces move in.
לא להיכנס, אני אומר לך.
בסדר, לא להיכנס. לא להיכנס.
חבר'ה, לא להיכנס. חבר'ה, לא להיכנס.
They didn't want the cooperative break-in into the synagogue to be filmed.
תלווה אותם החוצה. תלווה אותם החוצה.
Notice how they break into the hall where the protesters are being held captive. The Shin Bet agent goes in first. He stands at the entrance, facing the soldiers. Now the first soldiers burst in. But the evacuation doesn't begin yet. Zambish and Bar Chai go in after the first soldiers. They pass the soldiers and sit at the head of the protesters. Now the evacuation begins. Of the thousands of people in the synagogue, the soldiers approach Tzviki Bar Chai and take him out first. Just a moment ago, he came into the synagogue as part of the expulsion force, and now he is the first to be expelled. If not for this Jew who couldn't hold his peace in the face of this shameful expulsion, their show might never have ended. If the protesters had joined this man, the evacuation would have got entirely out of control. The Shin Bet agent goes into action. He picks up Bentzi Lieberman, who is sitting in the front row, just in case. Bentzi sees that no one is going to help him. Everything is back under control. Bentzi goes back to his seat. Not one of the thousands of people there joined the man who fought the soldiers there on his own. The soldiers beat the man and drag him violently out of the synagogue. The commander wants to continue the evacuation, as agreed upon in Uri Bar Lev's briefing. He points at the person whom he wants the soldiers to evacuate now. The soldiers approach the man with the same violence they just used to drag the other man out of the synagogue. Uri Bar Lev yells at the soldiers to stop using violence. When he is unsuccessful, he orders the commander to stop the soldiers from using violence. The commander tries to calm the soldiers who are pulling the man by force. This is the man with the blue hat and the orange ribbon, Zambish. The commander has to shake the overwhelmed soldier until he lets go of Zambish. Zambish picks himself up, and goes back to the side of the expulsion forces. From here, he directs the evacuation together with Uri Bar-Lev, Ze'ev Hever, the man who runs the YESHA Council, General Secretary of the Amana Foundation, which funds the YESHA Council. Zampish, who is considered to be the father of the settlement enterprise, now directs the violent evacuation of the synagogue. The evacuation was a rare opportunity for us to see who these people really are. We saw their true face. The press did everything in its power to erase these moments from the public consciousness. They saw to it that no one would see this footage. Rabbi Shlomo Aviner, who was put in charge of the women, managed to hide his connection to the evacuating forces. When he tore his garment, that was the signal that the resistance to the evacuation was over. Before the spies turned into the implementers of the expulsion, they were the greatest fighters for settlement in Israel. They led the settlement enterprise in Judea and Samaria. What happened to them? How did they turn into our enemies? They say that we must obey the law. To them, the law is an entity that must always be cherished and respected. To them, the law is above the Torah, above morality, above everything. To them, the law is God. Perhaps the most important point of this story is that the public had nothing to do with it. The public was prepared to disobey every law in order to stop the expulsion. The public came in droves to Kfar Maimon against police orders. The public put its life aside. The public came to Gush Katif in defiance of the law. The public came to Kisufim Road to fight the law of the government. The public stayed in the Gush even though it was against the law. They tried to tell us that the public opposed the crusade, but that is a lie. The holy public did everything in its power to resist. The public has learned the lesson of the expulsion well. The very heart of the crusade is still before us. The great battle for Zion is at our gates. We will not let the spies get away with it again.